The morning sun cast long shadows across the Pacific Northwest coastline as marine biologist Dr. Rachel Winters prepared for what would become the most harrowing experience of her life. At 38 years old, she had dedicated nearly 2 decades to studying the delicate ecosystems of America's coastal waters. But this particular research expedition to the remote Aleutian Islands would test every ounce of her scientific training and survival instincts in ways she could never have imagined. The research vessel Tide Runner, a sturdy 40-foot craft that had been her floating laboratory for the past 3 weeks, rocked gently in the protected harbor of Dutch Harbor as she conducted her final equipment checks before departing for another day of underwater documentation and sample collection in some of the most pristine and challenging waters in North America. Her research partner, Dr. James Kellerman, worked alongside her with the practiced efficiency that came from years of joint expeditions studying the effects of climate change on kelp forest ecosystems throughout Alaska's coastal regions. Their collaborative work had taken on increasing urgency as ocean temperatures continued to rise at alarming rates, threatening the intricate web of marine life that depended on these underwater forests for survival, shelter, and feeding grounds. James, a soft-spoken but brilliant oceanographer from the University of Washington in Seattle, had been Rachel's closest collaborator and dearest friend for 5 years, and their research partnership had produced groundbreaking studies on the complex relationship between sea otter populations, kelp forest health, and the cascading effects of environmental changes on entire marine ecosystems. Today's mission would take them to a particularly remote and scientifically significant section of the Aleutian chain, where they hoped to document previously unstudied kelp communities that might hold crucial keys to understanding ecosystem resilience and adaptation in the face of rapid environmental change. The area they planned to investigate had been identified through satellite imagery analysis as containing unusually robust kelp forests that seemed to be thriving despite warming ocean temperatures that had devastated similar ecosystems elsewhere along the Pacific coast. Their research equipment included underwater cameras, water sampling devices, temperature monitors, and specialized collection tools designed to gather biological specimens without damaging the delicate organisms they were studying. The weather forecast issued by the National Weather Service had called for moderate swells of 3 to 5 feet and partly cloudy skies, with winds from the southwest at 15 to 20 knots. Conditions they had navigated successfully countless times during their extensive careers studying marine environments in challenging locations. Rachel checked the barometric pressure readings one final time, noting a slight drop that concerned her experienced eye, but nothing that seemed to warrant postponing their critically important mission or returning to port. The Tide Runner was equipped with state-of-the-art navigation systems, multiple emergency beacons, comprehensive safety equipment, and survival gear that exceeded all Coast Guard requirements for vessels operating in these remote and potentially dangerous waters. Both scientists understood the inherent risks involved in their work, and their families back home in Oregon and Washington had long ago accepted the dangers that came with advancing scientific knowledge in some of the world's most challenging marine environments. Rachel's parents, retired teachers living in Portland, had always supported their daughter's passion for ocean science, while James's wife and 2 young children in Seattle knew that his work contributed to crucial understanding of environmental changes that would affect future generations. Both researchers had maintained impeccable safety records throughout their careers and possessed extensive experience operating in challenging maritime conditions that would have deterred less experienced scientists. If you're finding this incredible survival story as compelling as we are, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Your support helps us continue bringing you these remarkable tales of human resilience, determination, and the extraordinary will to survive against impossible odds. By 11 o'clock that September morning, the meteorological situation aboard the Tide Runner had begun to deteriorate with frightening speed and intensity that caught both experienced scientists completely off guard. What National Weather Service meteorologists had been tracking as a minor weather disturbance in the Gulf of Alaska had intensified into a fierce and dangerous squall system, with winds rapidly increasing from the predicted 15 knots to over 60, and waves that had grown from manageable 2-foot swells to towering walls of water reaching 18 feet in height and showing no signs of diminishing. Rachel fought desperately to secure loose scientific equipment and valuable research samples, while James battled to maintain crucial radio contact with the Coast Guard station in Kodiak, their primary communication link to the outside world, and their only hope for emergency assistance if conditions continued to worsen. The vessel's reliable diesel engine began showing ominous signs of distress, sputtering irregularly and losing power as the fuel lines and filtration systems struggled against the violent motion of the storm-tossed craft. Years of dependable service in challenging conditions had not prepared the Tide Runner for the extraordinary stresses imposed by this rapidly intensifying weather system. The engine room began taking on water through ventilation systems that could no longer be sealed effectively against the mountainous waves that crashed over the vessel with increasing frequency and violence. James deployed emergency bilge pumps while maintaining radio contact, but their combined efforts were proving insufficient against the relentless assault of wind and water. The complete mechanical failure that followed was both sudden and catastrophic in its scope and implications. The Tide Runner's main diesel engine seized completely without warning, leaving them powerless and helpless against the increasingly violent seas that now threatened to overwhelm their disabled vessel. Without engine power to maintain heading and stability, the research vessel began taking on dangerous amounts of water through deck hatches, ventilation systems, and structural joints that could no longer be properly sealed against the massive waves that swept across their craft with the force of freight trains. Emergency hand pumps proved woefully inadequate against the volume of water entering the vessel, and both scientists realized they were facing a life-threatening emergency that would require immediate action to survive. James managed to deploy their emergency position indicating radio beacon, while Rachel worked frantically to gather essential survival supplies into waterproof containers, including emergency food rations, water purification tablets, comprehensive medical supplies, emergency blankets, and her waterproof research journal that would later prove crucial to her survival and rescue. The decision to abandon ship came when seawater began flooding the main cabin, short-circuiting their navigation equipment and threatening to sink the vessel within minutes. Their 4-person life raft deployed automatically when James pulled the activation cord, inflating rapidly in the churning water beside their sinking vessel. As they prepared to transfer from the doomed Tide Runner to their life raft, a massive wave, estimated at over 20 feet in height, swept across the vessel's deck with the devastating force of a natural disaster. Rachel watched in absolute horror as James lost his footing on the rain-slicked and wave-swept surface, his safety harness straining against the tremendous hydraulic pressure before the reinforced line snapped like thread under the incredible force. In an instant that would replay in her nightmares for months afterward, her colleague, research partner, and dear friend vanished beneath the churning foam and debris, swallowed by the grey-green chaos of the storm-driven sea. Rachel screamed James's name until her throat was raw and her voice was lost in the howling wind, scanning the chaotic seascape desperately for any sign of her colleague's bright orange survival suit or emergency beacon. The Tide Runner was settling deeper into the water with each passing moment, its hull compromised and its compartments flooding rapidly. She faced an agonizing choice that would haunt her conscience for the rest of her life: spend precious minutes searching for James and risk losing the life raft that represented her only realistic chance of survival, or save herself and pray that James had managed to activate his personal flotation device and emergency locator beacon before disappearing beneath the waves. With tears streaming down her face and her heart breaking from the impossible decision, Rachel cut the line, securing her to the sinking vessel, and allowed the life raft to drift away from the wreckage. The four-person raft, designed and equipped to support multiple survivors for up to 10 days under normal conditions, became her solitary refuge as she watched the tide runner disappear beneath the surface, taking with it years of research data, expensive scientific equipment, and any hope of finding James alive. The emergency supplies packed into the raft's waterproof compartments included enough food and fresh water for several days if carefully rationed. A solar still capable of producing additional fresh water from seawater, waterproof matches, signal flares, basic fishing equipment, and a comprehensive first aid kit that she desperately hoped she wouldn't need to use extensively during her ordeal. The storm continued to rage for the next 18 hours, tossing Rachel's life raft like a cork on the massive swells, while she struggled to maintain her position inside the small craft and prevent the loss of essential supplies. She activated her personal emergency locator beacon immediately after reaching the relative safety of the raft, knowing that search and rescue protocols would bring help within days under normal circumstances. However, the violent weather conditions were interfering with electronic communications and making aerial searches virtually impossible, while the storm's powerful currents and winds were carrying her far from her last known position into some of the most remote and rarely traveled waters in the North Pacific. During the first 72 hours adrift in the life raft, Rachel maintained cautious but persistent optimism that rescue would come quickly through the well-established search and rescue networks that operated throughout Alaska's coastal waters. Her background in marine navigation, developed through years of fieldwork in remote locations, told her she was drifting northward toward the outer islands of the Aleutian chain, carried by powerful currents that were taking her further from the main shipping lanes, where commercial vessels or Coast Guard patrols might spot her small craft. She established strict rationing protocols for her limited supplies, allowing herself only small sips of water at regular intervals and tiny portions of high-energy emergency food bars that would need to sustain her until rescue arrived. Her scientific training proved invaluable as she began keeping detailed and systematic records of weather patterns, her physical condition, estimated position based on celestial navigation techniques learned during graduate school, and observations about ocean currents and wildlife that might provide clues about her location. The waterproof journal became both a practical survival tool and a crucial psychological anchor, helping her maintain mental discipline and emotional stability during the long hours of uncertainty, fear, and growing realization that rescue might not come as quickly as she had initially hoped. Writing in the journal gave her a sense of purpose and connection to her scientific identity, even as she faced the most primitive survival challenges imaginable. On the fourth day of her ordeal, land appeared through the morning mist like a mirage that gradually solidified into blessed reality. A small, unnamed island materialized roughly 2 miles off her starboard side, its rocky coastline both promising sanctuary from the endless ocean and presenting new challenges and dangers that she would need to overcome. The life raft had developed a slow but persistent leak from constant friction against debris and the stress of 4 days in heavy seas. And Rachel realized with growing urgency that she needed to reach the safety of solid ground before her only means of survival became completely unusable and left her helpless in the water. Using the emergency paddle included in the raft's survival kit and applying her extensive knowledge of coastal currents and wave patterns, She fought against wind and tide for nearly 8 hours in an exhausting battle to reach shore. The island's coastline presented numerous hazards, including submerged rocks, powerful surf, and steep cliffs that offered few safe landing opportunities. Finally, as the sun began to set on her 4th day of survival, she managed to beach the damaged raft on a small pebble shore, protected by towering basalt cliffs that provided shelter from the worst of the coastal winds and wave action. The island that would become Rachel's home for the next month was an unnamed landmass, roughly 2 miles long and 3/4 of a mile wide, characterized by harsh but not entirely barren terrain, covered with hardy grasses, stunted willow trees, thick patches of sphagnum moss, and scattered wildflowers that indicated sufficient rainfall and soil conditions to support diverse plant life. Most crucially for her long-term survival prospects, she discovered a small but reliable freshwater stream cascading down from the island's central ridge, providing the clean drinking water that would be absolutely essential for surviving more than a few days in this remote location. Systematic exploration of her new environment during the first week revealed the partially collapsed but still substantial remains of what appeared to be a World War II-era military installation, most likely a weather monitoring station, aircraft spotting post, or radio communication facility that had been hastily abandoned when the war ended and military priorities shifted elsewhere. The concrete foundations, scattered metal debris, corrugated steel sheets, and other construction materials would prove invaluable as she worked to create shelter and survival systems that could sustain her through the challenging weeks ahead. The installation's elevated position provided excellent protection from coastal storms and offered an outstanding vantage point for spotting potential rescue aircraft or ships that might pass within visual range of the island. Rachel's extensive background in marine biology became her greatest asset as she learned to identify, harvest, and prepare the island's abundant natural food sources with scientific precision and safety protocols that prevented potentially fatal mistakes. The rocky intertidal zones that surrounded much of the island's coastline contained vast populations of mussels, barnacles, limpets, sea urchins, and various species of edible seaweeds that provided essential nutrients, calories, and variety in her survival diet. She fashioned crude but surprisingly effective fishing tools from debris found around the abandoned military site and discovered productive techniques for trapping small fish in tidal pools during low tide periods when marine life became concentrated in shallow water. Her scientific knowledge of coastal ecosystems, developed through years of fieldwork in similar environments, helped her avoid potentially toxic species while maximizing her harvest of safe, nutritious marine organisms that would sustain her health and energy throughout her ordeal. She established systematic harvesting routines that prevented overexploitation of local food sources and ensured sustainable yields from the island's marine resources. Additionally, she identified several species of edible plants and berries that supplemented her primarily seafood-based diet with essential vitamins and minerals that might otherwise have led to nutritional deficiencies during extended survival. The psychological and emotional challenges of complete isolation proved every bit as difficult and demanding as the physical requirements of finding food, water, and shelter in this remote environment. Rachel established comprehensive daily routines that included equipment maintenance, food gathering and preparation, shelter improvements and repairs, physical exercise to maintain strength and cardiovascular fitness, and extensive journal writing that helped her maintain mental discipline, emotional stability, and connection to her identity as a scientist and human being. She talked aloud to herself regularly, practicing conversations with family members, colleagues, and friends to keep her communication skills sharp and combat the disorienting and potentially dangerous effects of prolonged solitude on mental health. Her research training in systematic observation, data collection, and scientific methodology provided a crucial framework for understanding and adapting to her environment while maintaining the intellectual rigor and curiosity that had defined her professional life. She conducted informal studies of the island's ecosystem, weather patterns, tidal cycles, and wildlife behavior, treating her survival situation as an unplanned but scientifically valuable field study that might contribute to knowledge about island ecology and human adaptation to extreme environments. This scientific approach gave her a sense of purpose beyond mere survival and helped maintain her mental acuity during the most challenging periods of her ordeal. As her first week on the island stretched into a second and then a third, Rachel's initial optimism about quick rescue began to fade as the reality of her situation became increasingly clear. She had spotted several aircraft in the distance during her time on the island, including what appeared to be Coast Guard search planes, commercial flights following standard routes between Anchorage and the Pacific Northwest, and private aircraft that might have been conducting search operations. However, none of these aircraft had come close enough to her position for effective signaling, despite her best efforts to attract attention using signal mirrors, bright clothing, and carefully positioned reflective materials. Her precious emergency flares represented irreplaceable resources that she could only afford to use when aircraft seemed to be following deliberate search patterns rather than routine flights, and she developed sophisticated criteria for determining when the probability of successful signaling justified expending these limited assets. The psychological impact of watching potential rescue opportunities pass by without result was devastating, but she forced herself to maintain strict discipline in the use of emergency signaling equipment that might represent her only chance of eventual rescue. Her shelter evolved gradually from a basic windbreak constructed with life raft materials and salvaged debris into an increasingly sophisticated structure that incorporated metal sheets, concrete blocks, and other materials recovered from the abandoned military installation. She created an efficient rainwater collection system using improvised gutters, containers, and filtration methods that supplemented the freshwater stream and provided backup water sources during dry periods when the stream's flow decreased significantly. The solar still from her emergency kit provided an additional source of fresh water, though its output was limited and required careful maintenance and optimal positioning to function effectively in the island's variable weather conditions. The inspiration for her message in a bottle strategy came during her third week of isolation, born from a combination of growing desperation and practical problem-solving instincts that had served her well throughout her scientific career. She had been maintaining detailed daily entries in her waterproof research journal, documenting not only her survival activities, physical condition, and environmental observations, but also her thoughts about James, her family, her research work, and her hopes for eventual rescue and return to normal life. The journal entries served multiple crucial purposes. They kept her mind sharp and engaged, provided a comprehensive record that might help future rescue efforts or survival research, and offered essential emotional release during the darkest and most difficult moments of her prolonged ordeal. Among the debris scattered around the abandoned military site, Rachel discovered several glass bottles of various sizes and conditions that had somehow survived decades of harsh weather, temperature extremes, and the gradual deterioration that had claimed most other fragile materials at the site. She carefully selected the most intact and suitable bottle, a dark green wine bottle with a cork that could be properly sealed against seawater intrusion and would provide the best chance of protecting her message during potentially weeks or months of ocean drift before possible discovery. Her message, written on waterproof paper with a mechanical pencil from her research supplies, included comprehensive information designed to maximize the chances of successful rescue if the bottle was eventually discovered. She provided her full name, professional credentials, and contact information, the exact date and circumstances of the shipwreck that had stranded her, Detailed information about her approximate location based on careful celestial navigation observations and landmark identification, a thorough description of the island's distinctive features and characteristics that would help rescue teams identify her location, and a heartfelt plea for rescue that included emergency contact information for her family members and professional colleagues who could verify her identity and coordinate rescue efforts. She prepared multiple messages over the course of a week, varying the content slightly and timing their release to coincide with different tidal conditions, weather patterns, and current flows that she had observed and documented in her survival journal. Her extensive knowledge of coastal oceanography, developed through years of fieldwork studying marine ecosystems and current patterns, helped her identify the most promising times and locations for launching the bottles to maximize their chances of reaching inhabited coastlines, shipping lanes, or fishing areas where they might be discovered by people who would understand their significance and take appropriate action. The bottles were launched from different points around the island during optimal tidal and weather conditions, with Rachel calculating the most likely drift patterns based on her observations of current flows, wind patterns, and the movement of floating debris that she had tracked as natural indicators of water circulation around her island refuge. Each bottle launch was carefully planned and executed with the precision of a scientific experiment, representing her best hope for establishing contact with the outside world and summoning the rescue that seemed increasingly unlikely to arrive through conventional search and rescue operations. Meanwhile, back on the mainland, the search and rescue operation coordinated from Coast Guard facilities in Alaska had reached a critical juncture that would determine whether the search would continue or be officially suspended due to resource limitations and the low probability of finding survivors after so much time had passed. Captain Robert Hanley, a veteran rescue coordinator with 23 years of service in Alaska's challenging and often unforgiving waters, had led the initial search efforts with characteristic determination, thoroughness, and refusal to abandon hope, even when statistical probability suggested that survival was unlikely after the first week of the operation. The comprehensive search operation had involved multiple Coast Guard cutters equipped with advanced radar and sonar systems, aircraft from both military and civilian sources flying carefully planned search patterns over thousands of square miles of ocean, and volunteer vessels from the region's commercial fishing fleet who had joined the effort despite the significant costs and risks involved in searching such remote and dangerous waters. The coordination of these diverse assets required exceptional skill and experience, with search patterns calculated to account for wind drift, current flows, and the most likely survival scenarios based on decades of rescue experience in similar conditions. The emergency beacon from the Tide Runner had transmitted intermittently for approximately 6 hours after the vessel's last radio contact before falling silent, either due to equipment failure, battery exhaustion, or submersion, as the vessel sank beneath the storm-driven waves. This limited transmission time had provided searchers with only a rough approximation of the vessel's last known position, complicated by the storm conditions that had made precise navigation impossible and had significantly altered normal current patterns and drift calculations that rescue coordinators relied on to predict survivor movement. The search area encompassed hundreds of square miles of some of the most challenging and dangerous waters in North America, characterized by unpredictable weather patterns, strong currents, numerous islands, and rocky outcroppings that could hide survivors or wreckage, and depths that made recovery of evidence extremely difficult, even with sophisticated underwater search equipment. After 2 intensive weeks of searching that had covered thousands of square miles and consumed enormous human and financial resources, the official search was reluctantly suspended according to standard protocols, though family members continued funding private search efforts and maintaining political pressure on authorities to resume the operation. The discovery that would ultimately save Rachel's life came from an entirely unexpected source and demonstrated the unpredictable nature of ocean currents and the sometimes miraculous coincidences that can determine the difference between life and death in survival situations. Tony Vasquez, a third-generation commercial fisherman operating out of Unalaska Island, was working his salmon nets in waters roughly 60 miles from Rachel's Island when he spotted something unusual floating among the kelp beds that surrounded his traditional fishing grounds where his family had worked for decades. The wine bottle, weathered by nearly a month in the harsh North Pacific environment and partially obscured by marine growth and debris, might easily have been dismissed as common maritime litter by a less observant or curious person. However, Tony's experienced eye was immediately drawn to the bottle's unusual appearance and the fact that it clearly contained paper materials that had somehow remained dry despite weeks of exposure to salt water, storms, and the constant motion of ocean waves. His decision to retrieve and examine the bottle more closely represented the kind of maritime curiosity and thoroughness that characterizes the best commercial fishermen and would prove to be Rachel's salvation. Upon carefully opening the bottle and extracting Rachel's message, Tony immediately recognized the significance of what he had discovered and understood that time was critically important if there was any chance of mounting a successful rescue operation. He contacted the Coast Guard through his vessel's radio equipment, providing detailed information about the message's contents, the location where he had discovered the bottle, and his professional assessment of current patterns and drift calculations that might help rescuers determine the message's point of origin and plan an effective search operation. Within 2 hours of Tony's radio call, Captain Hanley was working with oceanographic specialists and search planning experts to plot a new search area based on Rachel's location estimates, detailed ocean current data for the previous month, and sophisticated computer models that calculated the probable drift patterns that had carried the bottle from its launch point to its discovery location. The analysis suggested several possible areas where Rachel might be stranded, with priority given to uninhabited islands that matched her description and lay within the calculated drift zone for the message bottle. Rachel's 34th day on the island began with the same methodical routines that had kept her alive, mentally stable, and physically capable throughout her remarkable ordeal. She checked her water collection systems for damage or blockages that might reduce their efficiency, examined her fishing equipment and food preparation tools for wear or deterioration that might affect their effectiveness, gathered edible seaweed and shellfish during the morning low tide when these resources were most accessible, and maintained the signal fire that she had kept in constant readiness for immediate activation since her first week on the island, when she had realized that rescue might require weeks rather than days. Her physical condition had deteriorated significantly during the month of survival, with dramatic weight loss of nearly 30 pounds, numerous minor injuries and infections that she had treated with limited medical supplies, chronic fatigue from the constant stress and physical demands of survival, and the beginning of nutritional deficiencies despite her careful management of available food resources. However, her determination remained unshakable, supported by scientific discipline, systematic planning, and an absolute refusal to surrender hope even during the darkest and most difficult moments of her prolonged ordeal. The distant sound of helicopter rotors initially seemed like another cruel auditory hallucination, a phenomenon she had experienced several times during particularly difficult periods, when stress, fatigue, and isolation had combined to produce false sensory experiences that had initially filled her with hope before proving to be products of her desperate imagination. However, As the sound grew louder, more distinct, and unmistakably mechanical rather than natural, Rachel realized with growing excitement and disbelief that this time the sound was genuinely real and represented the rescue she had fought so hard to achieve. The bright orange Coast Guard HH-60 Jayhawk helicopter crested the rocky ridge above her carefully constructed campsite, its distinctive markings and professional flight patterns immediately identifying it as a genuine rescue aircraft, rather than another false hope or cruel trick of her exhausted mind. Rachel activated her signal fire with trembling hands that barely functioned after weeks of malnutrition and stress, sending a towering column of dense, dark smoke into the clear morning air that served as an unmistakable beacon for the rescue crew and confirmed her location beyond any possible doubt. The actual rescue operation proved technically challenging and potentially dangerous due to the island's difficult terrain, unpredictable wind patterns that had been created by the interaction between the island's topography and prevailing weather systems, and the need to maintain precise aircraft control while conducting rescue operations in an environment with limited landing options and numerous hazards that could threaten both the aircraft and rescue personnel. The helicopter crew, led by experienced rescue swimmer Petty Officer Lisa Chang, had to carefully assess landing options, wind conditions, and operational safety factors while maintaining constant visual contact with Rachel and preparing for a complex rescue operation that would require exceptional skill and coordination. The rescue basket descent required precise coordination between the flight crew managing aircraft position and stability and ground operations conducted by rescue personnel who had to account for wind gusts, terrain obstacles, and the physical condition of a survivor who had endured more than a month of extreme survival conditions. Rachel's emotional state during the rescue was a complex mixture of overwhelming relief, profound gratitude, deep sadness for James, whose fate remained unknown, and a sense of surreal disconnection from the civilized world that she was rejoining after so long in complete isolation. As the rescue basket descended toward her makeshift campsite, Rachel gathered her precious research journal and a few personal items that had sustained her psychologically during her ordeal, leaving behind the shelter, tools, and survival systems that had kept her alive for more than a month, but would no longer be needed. The helicopter ride to the Coast Guard station in Kodiak provided her first human contact in 34 days, and she struggled to form coherent sentences and communicate effectively as she attempted to describe her experience to the medical personnel who began comprehensive assessment of her physical and psychological condition during the flight to medical facilities. The initial medical evaluation at the Coast Guard station revealed that despite her dramatic weight loss, numerous minor injuries, and obvious signs of prolonged stress and malnutrition, Rachel had managed her survival with remarkable skill, scientific precision, and psychological resilience that had prevented the major medical complications that often result from extended survival ordeals in harsh environments. Her detailed records of water and food consumption, physical symptoms, environmental conditions, and psychological states provided valuable data for survival researchers, rescue training programs, and medical professionals who study human adaptation to extreme stress and isolation. The psychological evaluation conducted by specialists experienced in treating survivors of extended ordeals indicated significant signs of stress, trauma, and adjustment difficulties that would require ongoing professional support, but also demonstrated extraordinary mental toughness, adaptive capacity, and emotional resilience that had been crucial factors in her successful survival. The transition back to normal life would require time, patience, and professional support, but her fundamental psychological health and strong support network provided an excellent foundation for full recovery and eventual return to normal activities and relationships. The reunion with her family at the hospital in Anchorage became an emotional milestone in her recovery process and demonstrated the power of human connections that had sustained her hope throughout the darkest periods of her isolation. Rachel's younger sister Jennifer had never abandoned hope for her sister's survival, organizing community search efforts, maintaining constant communication with Coast Guard officials and political representatives, coordinating media attention that kept the story in public consciousness, and providing emotional support to other family members during the agonizing weeks of uncertainty about Rachel's fate. Her parents, both retired educators from Portland, Oregon, who had dedicated their careers to teaching and nurturing young minds, had traveled to Alaska immediately after the initial rescue efforts began and had remained there throughout the extended search period, providing emotional support to search teams, maintaining vigil for their daughter's safe return, and serving as liaisons between the family and the various agencies involved in rescue operations. Their presence in Alaska during the search had provided crucial continuity and advocacy that helped maintain official interest in the rescue effort even after formal search operations had been suspended. The media attention surrounding Rachel's rescue was intense, persistent, and sometimes overwhelming for someone who had spent more than a month in complete isolation and was still adjusting to human contact and the complexities of civilized life. However, she recognized the platform that media interest provided and used it strategically to honor James's memory, advocate for improved safety protocols for research vessels operating in remote waters, and share the lessons learned from her survival experience with other researchers, mariners, and survival enthusiasts who might benefit from her hard-won knowledge and experience. Her detailed account of the survival experience, based on the comprehensive journal she had maintained throughout her ordeal, provided valuable insights for other mariners and researchers who might face similar emergencies in remote locations where rescue might be delayed or complicated by weather, distance, or equipment failures. She worked closely with equipment manufacturers to suggest practical improvements to life raft designs, emergency food supplies, and survival equipment based on her first-hand experience of what worked well and what could be improved to increase survival chances in extended emergency situations. In the months following her rescue, Rachel dedicated considerable time and energy to working with Coast Guard officials, maritime safety organizations, research institutions, and equipment manufacturers to develop improved emergency protocols, training programs, and safety equipment that could help prevent similar tragedies and improve survival outcomes for researchers and mariners who found themselves in emergency situations far from immediate rescue. Her survival journal, with its detailed daily entries documenting everything from weather patterns and food sources to psychological coping strategies and equipment performance, became a valuable resource for survival training courses, emergency preparedness programs, and research into human adaptation to extreme stress and isolation. The data she had systematically collected during her ordeal contributed significantly to research on human physiological and psychological responses to extreme stress, prolonged isolation, and survival conditions, providing scientists with rare first-hand documentation of extended survival that is typically impossible to study under controlled conditions. Her scientific background and systematic approach to documenting her experience created an unprecedented database of survival information that has been used to improve training programs, equipment design, and rescue protocols for various organizations involved in maritime safety and emergency response. The establishment of the James Kellerman Memorial Scholarship Fund became one of Rachel's most important and personally meaningful post-rescue projects, ensuring that her colleagues' passion for marine research and environmental protection would continue to inspire and support future generations of scientists dedicated to understanding and protecting marine ecosystems. The scholarship program, supported by donations from the scientific community, maritime organizations, and members of the general public who had been moved by their story of dedication to science and environmental protection, provides financial assistance to graduate students pursuing oceanographic research with particular emphasis on climate change impacts and marine ecosystem conservation. The scholarship fund has grown significantly since its establishment, supporting dozens of young scientists who share James's commitment to understanding and protecting marine environments, and has become a lasting tribute to his scientific contributions and personal dedication to environmental protection. Recipients of the scholarship are required to spend time each year sharing their research with public audiences, continuing James's belief that scientific knowledge should be accessible to everyone, and that public understanding of environmental issues is crucial for effective conservation efforts. Rachel's eventual return to active research work was a gradual process that required extensive safety modifications, enhanced emergency protocols, and psychological support that reflected the hard-learned lessons of her survival experience and the need to balance scientific advancement with reasonable safety precautions. Her first expedition back to sea, nearly 18 months after her rescue, included advanced satellite communication systems that provided constant contact with shore-based operations, redundant safety equipment that far exceeded standard requirements, support vessels that maintained visual contact during all research activities, and comprehensive emergency protocols that had been developed based on analysis of her survival experience. The psychological challenges of returning to the ocean environment where she had lost her dear friend and nearly died herself required ongoing counseling, support from colleagues and family members, and a gradual exposure process that allowed her to rebuild confidence and comfort with maritime research activities. However, her fundamental commitment to marine science and environmental protection ultimately overcame the trauma and fear associated with her survival ordeal, demonstrating the power of purpose and dedication to overcome even the most challenging psychological obstacles. Her research in the years following her rescue has been enhanced by the unique perspective and appreciation for marine ecosystems that came from her month-long intimate connection with ocean-based survival. And she has become a more effective advocate for marine conservation through her ability to speak about the ocean from both scientific and survival perspectives. Her survival experience has added depth and authenticity to her scientific work and has made her a more compelling spokesperson for ocean protection and maritime safety issues. The simple message in a bottle that ultimately saved Rachel's life has become a powerful symbol of hope, human ingenuity, and the importance of never surrendering in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. Her story demonstrates that even in our modern age of sophisticated electronic communication, satellite tracking, and GPS technology, sometimes the most ancient and basic methods of sending messages across vast distances can prove most effective when modern systems fail or become unavailable due to equipment damage, power failure, or environmental conditions. The wine bottle that carried her message to safety is now preserved in a Coast Guard museum in Alaska, where it serves as a permanent reminder that survival often depends not just on expensive equipment and advanced training, but on creativity, determination, scientific thinking, and the fundamental human refusal to surrender hope even in the most desperate and seemingly hopeless circumstances. Visitors to the museum learn about Rachel's remarkable survival story and the importance of maritime safety, emergency preparedness, and the courage required to face life-threatening challenges with intelligence, determination, and unwavering hope for rescue and return to the people and work that give life meaning and purpose.